All right. Well, we're rounding the bend on our 2-day extravaganza. This has been remarkably productive, I think, wonderful talks, and super facilitation and administration by Will and Addie Rose and Marissa and others at the CASC. You're in the linking science to management session. I'm pretty excited about this. I want to just tell you about the 2 paradigms we're maybe going to lean on, our speakers are going to lean on in this hour and a half, and then we'll just get right into the talks. So I'm Toni Morelli, research ecologist with the USGS and the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. And I guess one of the things I wanted to introduce as a paradigm, if you're not familiar with it, is the idea of translational ecology. It's here in this flower petal. The principles are, our first speaker will be talking more about translational ecology. This is work that Carrie Enquist and a bunch of our colleagues, we put together a special issue on this in Frontiers in Ecology and Environment a couple years back. So you'll hear a little bit about it today, and hopefully that will make you interested to read more if you haven't already. We also have speakers focusing on decision science and specifically thinking about structured decision making. So that's there's a little image of that from the PROACT cycle on the right. And so these are sort of 2 different paradigms we're trying to blend into one workshop here today. We're going to have 5 speakers. They're going to be pretty short talks, about 10 minutes. And then we're going to have lots of time to either discuss your questions in kind of panel form, or if we have even more time, we'll go to a Jamboard and we can all kind of weigh in anonymously and have some conversations about what works and what doesn't, about linking management to science and science management from kind of the translational perspective, the decision science perspective, or other co-production perspective, or others that you have experienced. So with that, I will introduce our first speaker. Kerry Brownlima and I met in decision science workshop about 8 years ago or something. I don't know, 6 years ago. Anyway, we've been good friends and fantastic collaborators since, I think, at least she is for me. And I'm really happy to have her opening our session here. She's the director of the New York Invasive Species Research Institute, co-founder of the Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Risk Management Network. And she will be talking to us today about translational invasion ecology. Take it away, Carrie.
Great, thanks so much, Toni Lynn. I'm just going to share my screen here, and hopefully, I don't know which screen you're seeing. Hopefully it's the right one. Are you seeing my presentation?
We're seeing your notes.
Oh, okay. All right. I thought I had fixed that in line. All right. How's that?
Perfect.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. I'm really happy to be able to kick off this session. This is a topic I think about a lot in my work. And so I'm excited to share a little bit about what Toni Lynn and I have been doing through the Northeast Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Management Network. And this has been in collaboration also with Bethany Bradley from the University of Massachusetts, and a lot of other managers and researchers throughout the Northeast and the US. And so I'll just kick it off just by telling you a little bit about what I do at the New York Invasive Species Research Institute and what our role is. We were established in 2008 to work at the interface of research and management with the mission to coordinate invasive species research to help prevent and manage the impact of invasive species in New York and beyond. And we work within a comprehensive network here in New York State of stakeholders ranging from state agencies that are working with invasive species to land managers on the ground. And our role is to make sure they're getting the research that they need and hearing about up-to-date research, but also understanding what their research needs are and trying to coordinate research to meet those needs. And I'll touch back on that moving forward. But just to kick off, this idea of managers and researchers or decision makers and researchers working together is not new. Over 100 years ago, Woodrow Wilson pointed out the importance of people using information and people generating information working together. In the field of invasive species, we've seen an explosion of invasive species research over the past couple of decades. However, despite all of this growing research, and we have so much in the scientific literature about it, Virginia Mastek back in 2014 pointed out in her Conservation Letters article that there's still a gap between research and practice, so that a lot of this scientific information is accumulating, but it's not actually being used in management decisions. And she called this the knowing doing gap. And a lot of other researchers also identified this problem and published about it in scientific literature. And part of the reason that we think this is happening is because applied research takes this loading dock approach, where we kind of just publish things in scientific journals and expect that somehow it's going to trickle down and make its way out to the people who need that information. But as we know, that doesn't always happen. And part of the reason why that doesn't happen, and Mastek also pointed this out in her 2014 work, is that managers aren't actually going to peer-reviewed journals to get their information. They're learning from their informal conversations with their colleagues, from their own experiments out in the field, from synthesized information that they get from attending conferences. And if this was really to scale, peer-reviewed journals would be not even on my screen right now, because they're not, they don't have the time and the access often to get to that information. And not only that, they don't get to that information. A lot of times the information that we actually have in scientific journals doesn't exactly match what they need. So it's not on the right topic or not in the right context. And Mastek went on in 2015 to show through her interviews. So her 2014 work was interviewing invasive species managers. And she continued to interview them to find out what they actually needed. And then she looked at what was actually being produced and saw there was this mismatch between topics that researchers were publishing on and the ones that managers actually thought they needed. So this really pointed out this need to connect researchers and managers. And we really need the managers to identify what they need and to be a part of the research process. And we need researchers to be willing to tailor their, listen to those needs and tailor their research to answer those questions. And this is where translational ecology, or in translational invasion ecology, as Toni, Lynn, and I have been talking about a lot over the past 5 years and published this year in Biological Invasions on it, is we really need this approach that is intentional and inclusive. And it involves researchers, stakeholders, and decision makers so that they collaborate to develop and implement research via joint consideration of this sociological, ecological, and economic and political context in the area of invasive species, but also this can be applied to other ecological fields as well. And one real important piece of this puzzle, and this is something I've been doing with the Research Institute and also with the Risk Network, is that this doesn't just happen by chance, this engagement. You really need a boundary spanning institution that can play this role between the two sectors and help to facilitate, translate, mediate the two worlds, the research and the implementation world. And through this work, we've actually come up with this translational invasion ecology process. It's kind of a map that can help us step through from identifying our stakeholders in the problems all the way through to producing research and evaluating the impacts. And so I'm not going to go step by step through this, but this is available in our Biological Invasions publication, and Io is going to be talking a little more about a specific example of how we used it in her talk to come. But one of the things that we've been finding is that there's these interactions between invasive species and climate change, and that these two big problems were made worse when they were combined. And back in 2016, President Obama at the time amended the executive order on invasive species and highlighted that we really needed to incorporate climate change into invasive species decision-making. However, the managers, the stakeholders that I mentioned here in New York that I talk to every year about their research needs were saying they didn't know how to manage for upcoming biological invasions in light of climate change and really needed more research to become available to them so they can better decide what to do about the combined problem. So with that, that's when Toni, Lynn, and I and Bethany Bradley put together an exploratory workshop so that we could try to understand what the needs of the managers actually were and come up with a strategy on how to address those. And following that workshop, the Northeast Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Management Network was born with the mission to reduce the compounding effects of invasive species and climate change by synthesizing relevant science, communicating the needs of managers to researchers, building stronger scientist manager communities, and conducting priority research. So all of those pieces of all the petals of the flower that Toni Lynn showed you at the beginning of this session. The RISC network today has nearly 600 invasive species practitioners, educators, and researchers that participate in our listserv and in our conferences, workshops, and that also read a lot of our publications. And we have this great leadership team that's made up of researchers, students, and managers alike. And here are a bunch of us, but there's more that aren't listed here. So sorry to those that weren't showing up on the screen. But one of the big roles that RISC has taken on here is to be a boundary spanner, to really connect managers and researchers and to make sure that we're getting the information out. But before we got started with all this, really got engaged in all of this, one of our leadership team members, Eve Bowery, she led a research on, or she actually interviewed a lot of invasive species managers, much in the same way that MASTEC did, to try to understand what their needs were related to climate change and invasive species. So really taking that first step of the translational invasion ecology process. And she found out a lot of the same things that MASTEC found out, that really they weren't getting their information from the scientific journal, but really these one-on-one conversations, meetings and symposia, management documents, websites, and so on, so that we could really base our work in the RISC off of the findings from this paper that she published. She also found out what were the main topics related to invasive species and climate change that the managers were looking for. And this list that you see right on the screen is actually what has guided a lot of the work that the RISC network has done over the past 5 years. So based on this information, we started out not necessarily by doing our own research, but started by research, by translating and synthesizing research that other people had already done on the topic. And so the group started boiling down research articles, individual ones that were related to invasive species and climate change, and circulating what we call research summaries, where we just kind of give a little summary of the research, and then also some of the management implications, so they can be easily accessed by people that wouldn't normally be accessing scientific journal articles. And then in more complex topics, we actually synthesize the information on some of those key ideas that you just saw in that list, and we produce what we call management challenges. And then for those problems that aren't actually, don't already have the information out there for us to just share through the research summaries or management challenges, we actually started conducting some original research. So for example, range shifting species and hotspots was actually one of the top needs that came out. And this was something that we already had underway within our group. Bethany Bradley and Jenica Allen had been already thinking about this for years. So we built off the work that they had already been doing. And I just wanted to give a quick example outcome of how we actually worked in this way with our managers. So Bethany and Jenica's work started identifying which species were likely to move in to certain states or counties based on climate change predictions. And then they generated lists of invasive species that managers should be on the lookout for, and actually prioritize those using ICAT, which is a system for looking at how bad of impact some of these invasives would have. So what would the worst ones be, so that people could prioritize. They provided that information, to example, to New York State. We put them through our assessment process and proactively listed those species. So we didn't even let them come into New York State. And I should note that previously, New York State would really just put species as prohibited once they were already here, at which point it was a little too late to keep them out. So this was just like a really cool way that we can take it from research all the way to practice and really get managers the information they need to make better decisions. And then Jenica took this to be on a national level because every state was wanting that information. They provided to New York State and made a tool together with EdMaps that's now online where anyone can go in and see which plant species are likely to move in based on climate projections. So really making the information accessible to people who needed those for decision making. And finally, I know I'm getting short on time here, but one of the other areas that RISC has really been very active in is communicating and implementing getting this information out there. So we know that people want this information easily accessed and they want to be able to talk to one another about it. So we've been hosting webinars and we've also hosted an annual symposium. And that's been a great way to get people together. And we also use our listserv really actively to get out a lot of the information that we've been generating. And so having this network that's ever growing is really given us this like continuous connection and interaction with our stakeholders. And so I just wanted to wrap up by pointing out, we've got, if you're interested in how RISC was established, you might not be interested in invasive species and climate change. There might be other areas that you would like to kind of use this process. We did publish a kind of a guidebook to how we did it. And it talks about all the steps that we took over the years to make this happen. I also invite you to check out this recently published paper by Toni and Morelli, myself and a lot of our other colleagues. So you can see our thoughts and we give some case studies on that as well. And really just to point out that, climate change and invasive species is a pretty tricky problem, but it's really created this opportunity for us to work together and bring together managers and researchers. And that this has been a really effective method for helping us to reduce some of these really big impacts of invasives and climate change. And what's really exciting and cool about this is not only did we did this in the Northeast, but now this is being replicated throughout the country. And recently a North Central, a Pacific Islands, a Northwest, and a soon to be Southeast RISC are actually being established. And so this shows the strength of these manager researcher partnerships and how much people have valued it, that it's actually being kind of going global, going national here. So we'd love to have you guys get involved. Please join the RISC network if you're interested. And thanks so much for giving me the chance to share a little bit about this cool collaboration that we've had ongoing for the past 5 years.
Super, thanks, Carrie. One question in the chat, which actually might be good for us to take on as a group later, but let's just have you answer this one for now. Actually, I think I'm gonna, Sharon Putzinger, I think I'm gonna hold off on your question because I think it'll be a good one for the group, and Paul Stacy just got in right under the wire. So this looks like a good question for you, Carrie. It's hard not to be cynical about invasive species management since there are few cures and positive outcomes. Hopefully there's a question in here. I didn't read it first. So, oh yeah, there is. Maybe just look towards a new normal as the best solution. So maybe just speak a little bit about the idea of kind of how do you think about, trying to get rid of fix everything versus like being more realistic?
Yeah, I feel like there's a middle ground in there. Like, there is like this feeling that we just want to like give up because there's so many invasives and they're so negative and they're so hard to deal with. But I think this is where like opportunities like the RISC, where we identified chances to be proactive and prevent new species from coming in. I think that some of the techniques we've been using to prioritize some of the worst species is also important, and also really engaging with new technology that can help us catch populations while they're small, like eDNA or remote sensing. I think that we can be strategic. We're not going to solve all the invasive species problems of the world, but by preventing and by detecting things early, we can reduce some of the impacts. And so, I feel like I see that as the middle ground between totally giving up and thinking we're going to, get rid of all invasives, which isn't realistic.
Excellent. Thanks, Carrie. Well, that was a great intro to what's happening with translational invasion ecology. Now, our next speaker is going to go into one of the particular projects that was highlighted in our survey that Carrie just mentioned. And Ayodele Uhuru is one of our CASC graduate fellows and Master's of Science student in environmental conservation at UMass. I'm very lucky to work with her, and she's one of the 2 graduate fellows that are presenting in this session. So a lot of these science sessions, actually, we haven't had fellows present, but I'm very happy to have the fellows perspective of, or the student perspective of how to kind of do translational ecology, what works and what doesn't. So with that, Ayodele, you can take it away.
Hello, everybody. Can you all see my screen?
Looks great.
Okay, cool. Okay, so my name is Ayodele Oyuhuru, and my research is on sleeper species. And this is a good example of translational invasion ecology. So this figure is from the Translational Invasion Ecology paper that was published earlier this year, written by Toni Morelli and her colleagues on how to collaborate for actionable science. My research on sleeper species, which I'll get more into in the following slides, but has been focused around this roadmap. Here, I'll talk to you about the steps that I have been going to follow the TIE framework. I was not around for the initial conversation identifying sleeper species back in 2018, but my role in the TIE framework came from step 3. As a graduate student at UMass, I have been working on creating a priority list of sleeper species while having the opportunity to collaborate with other researchers, students, and stakeholders for actionable science. I have been listening to the feedback collected by the Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Management Network, which I will talk more about briefly, and started looking into plant species that will be problematic in the future. I then met with managers to discuss my findings. Currently, I have been back to step 3B, looking for more potential sleepers, using different approaches to create stronger outcomes. I have been evaluating my progress with my advisors and asking for ways to improve the methods for better results. The goal in the TIE framework in my research is to create a tangible list of sleeper species for managers that work within vulnerable ecosystems. The research on sleeper species started with the Northeast Risk Management Network, which is an organization that connects researchers to managers and other stakeholder groups by synthesizing literature and creating a space to communicate the science to those that need and want the information. The management challenges are a 2-page synthesis of topics related to invasive species and climate change, which you've all learned about in the last presentation. And from the Sleeper Species Management Challenge, published in 2018, came the idea to broaden the research of future invaders. So there have been new cases of non-native plant species establishing populations in new territories without spreading and becoming invasive. And this is represented in the blue straight line highlighted here. So sometimes plants are just going to establish and they're not going to do anything, and that's usually the case. But these non-native plants are also primary candidates of becoming sleeper species. When climate becomes favorable, these sleepers can awaken and start the invasion curve. For my research, I am looking into literature reviews for plant populations that are found in the Northeast that are currently not invasive, but are classified as invasive or noxious weeds elsewhere in the continental US. I'm using the environmental impact classification for alien taxa framework to quantitatively list potential sleeper species based on their negative ecological impacts to their introduced ecosystems. Using the ICAP protocol adapted by May Rockwell Postel, a former CASC fellow and UMass graduate, I have been using Web of Science databases to complete literature reviews for 104 plant species found using the criteria from the USDA plants database. Sorry. So each paper was assessed for negative impacts. And once these negative impacts were found, we compiled data on the papers by using a bunch of parameters, but the main ones were which systems were affected, and what scores what we would give the species that caused the negative ecological impacts using the ICAT scores of 1 meaning low concern to ecosystems and 4 showing major concerns to vulnerable ecosystems. We looked into different mechanisms of impacts such as competition and physical, structural, and chemical impacts, to name a few. And finally, where are the species located inside of these papers? So the most known invasive sleeper species is kudzu, or mile a minute. It is a perennial vine that alone does not seem to be a problem, but it can grow up to a foot a day once it's established. Currently, it is a sleeper in the northeast, but it is known as the vine that ate the South, and it's currently being managed in many states. From my preliminary results, these 3 plant species are listed as priority sleeper species because each are currently found in the northeast states, but are not currently invasive. But with the northeastern future climate projections, their climate suitability will be favorable and possible negative impacts can be matched in our areas. These 3 species are the common morning glory, goatgrass, and the meadowhawk. So also I'd like to take this time to say thank you to my best friend, Jack, who took this picture in Virginia when he was doing his studies on bats. And it's just really shocking to see how much of an impact this sleeper species could show. And I want to also say this with positivity. I am no expert in sleepers or TIE framework yet, but that's the really cool part of what I do. When trying to link science to management, I had a few questions like, how do we manage something that's not currently a problem? How will the information be useful for now and for the future? And how do we collaborate with managers while doing research to come up with products that will be useful on the ground? Honestly, I still don't have a straightforward answer to these questions, but I have been thinking proactively about management tools and the next steps for the research in my collaboration with managers. With my questions, I had 2 concerns with my role in the TIE framework approach. I am terrified of public speaking, so I hope I'm doing a really good job. And also, I'm having conversations with people who know way more than you do, and having to sound like you know exactly what you're talking about is honestly kind of scary. But again, I'm learning a lot within my approach of using the TIE framework. And I've also had amazing advisors, Bethany Bradley and Toni Morelli, along with my undergraduate, Justin Salva, intern, who has helped me find the correct words, data, and encouragement to have these conversations with stakeholder groups. So, to my successes of linking science to management, I have been working with the Risk Network to communicate my science to managers through research summaries, management challenges, and workshops. Over the summer, I have met with Rachel and Aaron from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Park Service to discuss my preliminary results on sleeper species. We brainstormed next steps, such as creating spatial components for sleepers using community science and finding out if sleeper species lists overlapped with their management areas. We have also discussed creating quick fact sheets for the top 10 sleeper species to help general public and managers identify and control them efficiently. I have been communicating my research at conferences, symposiums, and workshops to strengthen my comfortability talking about sleeper species collaboration with stakeholder groups. It is important to make actionable science by listening to needs of the managers and creating the research to support their efforts in a timely fashion, especially in invasion ecology. These connections can and will be important for improving natural resource management and translational invasion ecology now and in the future. So, thank you for letting me talk to you about my research on sleeper species.
Fantastic job, IOLA. I think you made a lot of people smile during your talk, even if you couldn't see it. And now you're going to get a bunch of those messages and chats. While we're waiting to see if anybody has any questions for IOLA, I'll ask one. So that was such a great way to show kind of what you've learned and some of your concerns coming in. If you were to encourage a listening student to be involved with translational work, what would you say is the thing that you like about it or were surprised about it? Something that was motivating, I guess, to one of the 82 people in the audience, not to scare you.
Yeah, no, so basically, so just to make sure I understand the question, you're asking about what has helped me through the framework of TIE?
Well, yeah, let's do that one. And then we'll see if let's ask, why don't you answer that question?
Okay, so yeah, so basically my drive in this framework is just that finding things that are going to possibly help someone later in the future is this theoretical concept, but it's actually going to help out now because then people are knowing that they're going to be possibly a problem now. So we can help someone later down the line without, before it gets too late, is like, I guess, my drive in the whole TIE framework, and having connections with managers that are doing the work right now on the ground, and they can tell me, okay, no, this isn't actually where we need to be looking, or this is exactly what we were supposed to be doing. It helps also drive the science home.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
All right, I think we'll leave it there, and I'll let you read all the wonderful chats. Hopefully you'll never be afraid of public speaking again, because you'll read all these chats and realize what a great job you did. So thank you. Our next speaker, we're going to move away from invasives, and Anna Tucker, the assistant unit leader in wildlife at Iowa Co-op Fish and Wildlife Research Unit, will be speaking to us and covering, moving a little bit more into the kind of decision science and wildlife side of things. So very happy to have you here, Anna, and you can take it away.
Okay, great. Hopefully you can hear me, see me. Yeah, thanks, Toni Lynn. And yeah, my job title is a little bit of a mouthful. So as Toni Lynn said, I'm the assistant unit leader of wildlife with the USGS Iowa Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some work that I've been involved with, starting with my postdoc with Mike Runge at the Eastern Ecological Science Center. So want to acknowledge his contribution to this as well. So much of the work that I do is generally motivated by the desire to deliver applied science that improves the clarity and transparency of management decisions. And we have a great toolkit of methods to support decision-making that are often used. So we have process tools, things like structured decision-making and adaptive management, that ensure decisions are science-based, logical, and transparent. We have a wide variety of science tools to better understand the natural systems that we're trying to manage, including estimation methods to understand relationships and methods to predict the consequences of our actions using system modeling. And we also have a variety of optimization tools that allow us to take that knowledge and, with our objectives, determine the best course of action to take. But there is an implicit assumption in most decisions, especially when we're using some kind of predictive modeling to understand the consequences of our actions. And that assumption is that observations of the past are good predictors of the future. Another way of saying this is that we assume the system is stationary. So there might be random fluctuations from year to year. For example, in this figure, I'm showing you a hypothetical survival probability that might fluctuate from year to year for a given species. But we assume on average that there's some constant value, and that that average value will continue into the future. But we all know that the world is rapidly changing. So this slide was taken directly from the IPCC press release slide deck from their latest working group report, showing the change in global surface temperature over time. And you can see a stationary period early on where temperatures fluctuate around a fairly constant average, as compared to the more recent non-stationary period that we're in today, where the average temperatures are rising steadily. They also note in this report that projected changes in climate extremes are expected to increase in both frequency and intensity. So it's not like we're settling into a new equilibrium. We are in a pattern of sustained non-stationarity. And I know this is a CASC climate adaptation symposium, but it's not just climate that's causing these this non-stationarity in wild systems, natural systems. So things like land use change, changing social values, dynamics of emerging diseases, invasive species, novel competitors or threats, interactions between all of these things could all lead to situations where the system is non-stationary. So we have a great toolkit already. We just need to add a few more tools. The science is clear about the many sources of non-stationarity that affect wildlife and natural resource systems, and we need optimization tools that can account for those changes. This was the motivation behind a Powell Center working group that I'm co-leading, as I said, with Mike Runge and Jamie Ashander with the USGS Eastern Ecological Science Center. And the Powell Center is a USGS center dedicated to bringing together interdisciplinary working groups for collaborative analysis and synthesis. And so this Venn diagram shows the main areas of expertise that we have represented in our group. Everything from management and natural resource policy experts, behavioral economics, decision analysis, climate modeling, migratory bird ecology, et cetera. And the goal of the working group is to develop a synthesis of existing and emerging tools for accounting for those non-stationary system dynamics in our decision-making frameworks. And so we have we're coming from a place of a decision analytic perspective. But these are really, really big questions and complicated subject areas. And this could easily turn into a sort of theoretical exploration of advanced optimization methods, which it is kind of in some regards, but we're doing that. But it was really important to us that the insights drawn from this group were directly relevant to real conservation and management problems. So from the beginning, from the proposal stage, we included partners from the Fish and Wildlife Service who are directly involved with different decision problems that have elements of non-stationarity. And we did this so that the tools that the working group develops are directly relevant to those needs. So I'm going to briefly describe each case study. We are still in the early stages of this work, so I don't really have results to show, but I'll just tell you a little bit about the specifics of each case study and some of the broader issues that they bring up. So the first problem comes from the Small Wetlands Acquisition Program under the Prairie Pothole Joint Venture. The goal of this program is to protect breeding waterfowl habitat in the incredibly productive prairie pothole region of the US, which is shown here on the map on the bottom right. So this is a large-scale, well-funded land acquisition program with the objective of waterfowl habitat conservation in perpetuity. And they have a current prioritization procedure that's based mainly on current and past observations of breeding duck density in the region. But there's been some recent climate modeling that indicates a shift in precipitation regimes in this region, leading to a potential shift in the distribution of quality habitat. So the PPJV wants to evaluate methods of prioritizing new areas for acquisition that are based on both the current and future habitat quality. And climate change is not just affecting the habitat, but also the distribution of ducks, risk of agricultural conversion, land prices in the region. So there's a lot at play. Broadly speaking, there are a suite of spatial optimization tools that have been developed to identify optimal areas for acquisition or protection based on input values like conservation value, land cost, other variables of interest. However, if under climate change, we expect the landscape to change, maybe something like this, habitat that was once high quality might become less so, or areas that were poor quality now might become better in the future. So what does a spatial optimization tool look like that can account for all of these changes? So protecting areas that we think are going to remain good, that are going to improve, and avoiding areas potentially that we think are going to get worse. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of things that go into this, not just the habitat value, but also land cost, risk of conversion, and so on. So the second case study is centered on the problem of regulating take and mitigation for protected species. So we're looking at this issue in the context of permitted take of golden eagles at wind farms. So this is a relatively substantial source of mortality for bald and golden eagles. And there's a current permit evaluation process by the Fish and Wildlife Service that considers the present risk of a given wind farm in deciding to issue a permit. This is an interesting problem because wind farm development in general is a good thing for moving away from fossil fuels and towards green energy. So we expect wind farm development to increase into the future, hopefully. So how can we devise a permitting and mitigation policy that will ensure the population stability of golden eagles? And here we have climate change linked to not just the eagle demographics and space use, but also some social and economic aspects about the demand for wind energy. So take is any loss of a protected species from activities that are otherwise lawful. So for example, development, bycatch, dam releases, and in most cases is permitted under the Endangered Species Act. And as part of that permit issuance, some mitigation actions are required to compensate for the take. So for example, habitat protection or restoration, reducing mortality from other source, or contributing to some general mitigation fund. But many sources of take, for example, development, we think might increase into the future. And so how do we account for that accumulating risk? And when it comes to assigning mitigation, there might be a finite number of mitigation options. So how can we develop a policy that will be sort of flexible to that and be sustainable into the future? All right, our third case study is on harvest policies, and Scott Boomer is going to go into detail about this one. So I'll try to just cover the basics. But the problem here is the regulation of waterfowl harvest, specifically mid-continent mallard. And so we have evidence that climate change and land use change influences breeding success via influencing the breeding habitat. And so we're working to develop harvest policies that are anticipatory of that future change. I do want to mention that a deeper dive on this problem is funded by the Northeast and Southeast CASC as well. So more broadly speaking about harvest, an understanding and predictions about population dynamics is really foundational to all wildlife harvest policies. If we understand the dynamics of population growth, for example, I'm showing a hypothetical density dependent population trajectory on the left. If we understand something about how that works, we can remove individuals from the population in a sustainable way. That math has been worked out over decades of wildlife research. But what if those dynamics start to change, especially in a directional way? Say if carrying capacity starts to systematically decline due to habitat loss, or population growth rate starts to decline year after year due to changing climate conditions. If we fail to account for those changes, what effect does that have on the population? Both under harvest and over harvest could be problematic depending on the system. And so we're thinking more broadly about how to develop harvest policies that are anticipatory of that potential change. So the overall goal of the working group is to develop meaningful and actionable answers to this question. How can we design decision-making frameworks that are responsive, anticipatory, and/or robust to future change? We're working on one paper to synthesize current knowledge and draw new insights across disciplines, the disciplines represented in our group. And we're using the case studies to really ground our conversations and to understand the common challenges and solutions for actually implementing these policies. So as I mentioned at the top, I think this is a really great example of translational ecology in practice, because we are working with our management partners in the Fish and Wildlife Service, from the inception of the project. And a key goal of the working group is to deliver actionable products. So the theoretical insights are important, but in some ways almost secondary to providing new frameworks for our partners to make better decisions in the face of this large-scale system change. So that's all I have. I'm looking forward to the Q&A discussion at the end, and I'll turn it back over to you, Toni Lynn.
Thanks, Anna. Don't go away. We've got one question from Paul Stacy. The Powell Center a great job, by the way. The Powell Center seems well structured to address these complex problems. Stationary does present a challenge in a changing and unpredictable climate. Does its layering on top of natural variation and long timescales for quantifying results impair your use of adaptive management to effectively inform management? How do you overcome some of those uncertainties?
Yeah, those are great questions, Paul. Do you want to join our working group? Yeah, I mean, those are exactly the types of questions that we're trying to tackle, right? How do we, when is adaptive management the way that we are using it now? When is that enough to sort of stay on top of system change? And in some cases it might be. And when is it not enough? When is change happening too rapidly for for adaptive management to be effective. I don't have answers to those questions right now, but we've had some really interesting conversations around those ideas, and hopefully we'll have some answers in the next few years that are useful. So stay tuned.
Excellent. Thanks, Anna. All right. So Anna set us up well for the next talk by Scott Boomer, along with Pat Devers at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So very happy to have you here, and you can take it away, Scott.
Thank you, Toni. And yes, thank you, Anna, for a great orientation to the topic. It's great to be here. And this is turning out to be a great session and highly relevant to some of the work that we're doing in adapting our harvest management decision frameworks to climate change. I'd like to acknowledge my co-author, Pat Devers, as well as the many members of the Harvest Management Working Group who back in 1995 established adaptive harvest management as the way we go about informing regulatory harvest decisions. So my goal really here is to highlight some of the challenges and some of the efforts that we have ongoing to address climate change in our adaptive management frameworks. And then to do that, I'm going to have to describe how we currently inform regulatory decisions, and then get into the details of some of the stuff that Anna just described. So adaptive harvest management really is an evaluation of a Markov decision process where we evaluate the state of the system. We have a suite of different decisions that we could make, and we want to determine which one is going to give us the biggest bang for our buck or the maximization of a return. And we iterate this procedure over time. And what makes this difficult is we have to deal with uncertainty. So for example, we may be uncertain as to the response of the system to the actual decision we make. If we dial up a particular harvest regulation, we're not sure what type of harvest rate or harvest level we'll achieve. In addition, we know that we don't perfectly observe the system, and our sampling protocols and our monitoring programs have sampling error. In addition, as Anna just described, there's a whole host of environmental variation that the system is responding to, and we would like to account for that in our decision-making, especially for waterfowl. And in addition, we have to account for different ideas about how the system might be behaving or what key factors are governing the system dynamics. And this is what we call typically structural uncertainty. And as we integrate or iterate this decision process over time, one of the great things about adaptive management is we hope to resolve some of that structural uncertainty and key in on and learn about the important mechanisms that are governing the system dynamics and our ability to manage optimally. So a little bit more about the environmental variation. As Anna described, the mid-continent mallard population, the primary breeding grounds in Prairie, Canada. And the left-hand figure is just a tree ring aridity index that Sochin et al. Developed. And it just shows that this is a highly dynamic environment. And going back all the way to the 1700s, there were periods of drought that exceeded decades. And we know from our monitoring programs that ducks populations here, graphed in the solid line, track the wetland conditions here measured as Canadian ponds very well. In fact, the number of Canadian ponds is a key variable in how we predict recruitment. The structural uncertainty that we care about that's most important with regards to harvest management is the strength of density dependence and the reproductive function. Here we've got two hypotheses, one a weak or strong density dependent parameterization, as well as the relationship between harvest mortality and survival, where we have two hypotheses. One is additive, which suggests that as kill rates increase, annual survival rates will decrease in a linear fashion. And that is the compensatory harvest mortality hypothesis that suggests that kill rates will not change, the annual survival rate will not change as kill rates increase up until a threshold. And then once that threshold is exceeded, then the survival rates will decline linearly. The important thing here is that depending upon which model you believe or which combination of reproductive or survival submodels you use could have major implications for the harvest policy that you derive in your regulatory decision. So how do we solve this Markov decision process? Well, as Anna mentioned, we do have a pretty good toolkit to determine what the right decision is, depending upon the state of the system. And I'm not going to get into the math here, but just recognize that we have a value function that allows us to account for the current return, that is the reward that we hope to accrue in year T with all future returns. Recognizing that the decision we make today is going to have implications for the types of decisions we're going to be making in the future. Through dynamic programming, we can achieve both of these ends in the derivation of harvest policy, or here what we call an optimal policy, which gives a optimal decision for any combination of the state variables that we care about. In this case, that's the breeding population size and the number of Canadian ponds that we observe each spring. That results in a harvest policy here. This is the 2019 Mid-Continent Mallard harvest policy, where habitat conditions in the form of Canadian ponds are arrayed across columns, and breeding population size is arrayed across the rows. And so for any combination of ponds and BPOP, the optimization procedure gives us the optimal decision to make. So we observe roughly 3.5 million Canadian ponds and a mallard breeding population greater than 8.5 million. So in 2019, the optimal decision was the liberal regulatory alternative. So how do we learn from this process? We've been doing this since 1995. Well, the great thing about having multiple models in our model set is that we can then predict and compare those predictions with observations. And that's essentially what I've done in the upper panel here. The open circle is the observed mallard breeding population, the 95% confidence bars. And then I've also plotted each model's prediction for that particular time step. And so the idea is that we hope that we can identify which model does a better job predicting with this comparison to observations. If we assume model weights or credibility measures are the same at the beginning of our management, that's what they essentially did in 1995 here. Here's the lower graph here, represents how model weights have changed. We can use Bayes' theorem to update these credibility measures each year as we get more and more observations. So you can see the trace here. The models did a fairly good job of predicting observed BPOP until 1999, when all four models underpredicted an observed population increase. As a result, we got some separation in model weights, and it just so happened that the additive survival weak density dependent model gained a fair amount of weight because it was ultimately closer to the observation. Over time, that model has continued to accrue model weight, and the great thing about adaptive management is this: we discern amongst these models that information in the form of model weights enters into our optimization so that our policy is responsive to this learning. That's the adaptation phase of adaptive management. So some key outcomes from this process for the last 20 plus years, there's no question that the AHM process has built trust in a cooperative environment or participatory environment. We've since developed additional decision-making frameworks based on the buy-in and the support of the collaboration within the harvest managed community. But I think the real benefit to adaptive harvest management has been the recognition that adaptive management allows for different beliefs about how the system's going to respond to exploitation and environmental change. It allows managers to disagree about potential regulatory impacts, but they agree to a process to discriminate amongst those competing hypotheses, in which we can use the adaptive management process to determine which model or which hypothesis is gaining more weight over time. However, as Anna mentioned, we are wrestling with a fundamental assumption that we've been making in our decision frameworks. And Nichols et al. Introduced this back in 2011. And as Anna mentioned, the idea that the historical relationships that we use to derive the functional relationships that drive our models may not necessarily hold moving into the future. In fact, Mike Runge and I found a similar type of shift in some of the distributional patterns for northern pintails, just indicating that these free-ranging populations are responding to climate change. And unfortunately, some of our decision frameworks may not be sensitive to some of those changes. So, there are definite technical challenges that we're trying to overcome in relation to these shifting dynamics. We've done a fairly good job of establishing linkages and developing new demographic models that are explicitly accounting for some key climatic variables, namely precipitation and temperature on the breeding grounds. And Anna and Mike Runge have made some really good progress in looking at the changes to the optimization frameworks that we may have to use if we want to deal with a non-stationary environment in our decision making. And I think this is in relation to that question that was just asked. We really are trying to determine how our operational decision frameworks can be changed or tweaked to maybe reduce some of the uncertainty associated with climate change, or at least account for it as we move forward in making our decisions. The Paul Center case study is definitely going to address that. And we also have a project with CASC looking at the Atlantic population, Canada geese, and the potential impacts of spring conditions on the breeding grounds up in the Angava Peninsula. However, I think the key challenge that we're going to have to overcome is the potential implications of dealing with time dependence in our optimization. Up until now, we tended to perform our optimizations with what's called an infinite time horizon. In a sense, we want to derive a stationary policy to take time out of the equation. So we don't have to worry about it. All we have to do is take the current snapshot of what the system state variables are doing and use that to inform the decision. But the minute you involve time dependence, now we're talking about a time horizon. That is the length of time that you're going to make the decision, as well as determining what the state of the system is going to be at the end of that horizon and what you hope to achieve. And so we really haven't dealt with some of these issues before in adaptive harvest management. And we are trying to determine the best way to engage our stakeholders and have conversations about how they may value things in the future versus how they value them now, which immediately brings up implications of how we would, use a discounting rate in our optimizations. Moreover, I think that, when we start thinking about specifying time horizons and terminal values, we really step back and say, well, how do we want to leave the state of the system? And who determines that? And how do we account for potential future changes when we know that that future is uncertain? It immediately brings up trade-offs relative to short-term gains and harvest opportunity or harvest values versus the conservation trust responsibilities we have with maintaining and conserving a viable population well into that time horizon. I think in general, though, we're finding ourselves in this double loop learning phase of adaptive management. We've been happily moving along in the iterative phase, making good optimal decisions, monitoring the system and learning under that assumption of stationarity. However, I think we're going to have to step outside of this iterative phase and re-enter the setup phase where we're going to have to re-engage our stakeholders to have meaningful conversations about how we're going to value things in the future and what type of alternatives we might consider, as well as how we're going to change our models and monitoring programs to account for climate change. So I think I covered all the aspects of structured decision-making in this talk, and there's some key connections to the translational ecology that Carrie described. And I think, we're going to have to develop tools and new approaches to get over this new challenge. Thank you.
That was super, Boomer. I have a question here that I think you kind of just answered, so it's okay if you want to just repeat yourself. This is a question that Sharon Petzinger gave us early on. So she speaks about invasives, but I think you'll see it's relevant to other issues as well. What can we do to help land managers sort through conflicting information about managing lands? Examples include the role of prescribed fire in managing invasive species and the role of fire in silviculture in helping forests become more resilient or transition to future climate conditions. But of course, harvesting can come in there as well.
Wow, yeah, that's a tough question. I think in the big scheme of things, what we're asking is, how do we handle uncertain events in the future, and how can we use the evidence that we've accrued to maybe dispel some of those notions of, misinformation or myths or what have you. And I think you have to step back and look at the decision context and where that information is relevant, and cast that information in that scheme, meaning how that information is going to be used in the decision explicitly to provide a better context, so we can, debunk the potential misinformation and stuff like that.
Excellent. Thanks so much for sharing your expertise, and thanks to Pat as well. Okay, last but certainly not least, my superstar that I get to work with for the last 6 years. I'm very excited to introduce now Nigel Golden, an CASC graduate fellow and PhD student in environmental conservation at UMass. And Nigel brings in a perspective of having done translational work for many years now and seeing the ups and downs of it. So thank you, Nigel, for being here today to share your expertise.
Happy to be here. Let me go ahead and share my screen here for a moment. Okay. We live in an age where researchers, practitioners, and communities around the world are exploring creative strategies to enhance resilience for species and ecosystems. The need for this being quite self-evident, cascading effects of recent anthropogenic actions on ecosystem structure and functioning, along with anthropogenic-driven climate change, are creating the conditions for an ongoing human-driven mass extinction. And in particular, right, the vast majority of those living in critically endangered environments could become extinct within a few decades. And so these pervasive human-driven decline of life on Earth points to the need for transformative change. And so one of the truths that come out of this recognition is that the fate of our biological diversity is closely tied to collaborations between researchers, practitioners, and communities that live in, alongside, and in relation with the biodiversity we wish to conserve. And so thus translational ecology was conceived with this truth in mind. So I don't have to go over it too much because Carrie, our first speaker, did such a wonderful job. But what I do want to go over is we've been witness to in the symposium and in previous talk. Some of us have a lot of personal experience with how translational ecology can be used for stakeholder engagement, can be used for transparency, implementing findings rapidly with the goal of greater impact. And as a result, recently, as the topic has been becoming more developed, there's still plenty of room, avenues of research to explore its various uses. The expectation being an increase in the uptake of translational ecology. So we have examples of translational ecology in wind industry. We have examples in community ecology, environmental law, recreational fisheries, and as two of our speakers have referred to, also in invasion ecology. So while this is all well and good, we also must remember that translational ecology, much like other knowledge exchange-like concepts, while providing a new critical way of creating actionable science, is not so straightforward, and at best offer tools that increase the likelihood that ecological science improves and informs decision-making for environmental management and conservation. So while you've seen examples of some of the possibilities from the various talks, for all of you here, it's also relevant to raise some awareness of some potential pitfalls. And so in this talk, I will have a brief moment and we can have a conversation about it for the panel if folks are more interested. Using my experience as a graduate student to discuss what those potential pitfalls may be. The interdisciplinary graduate student experience is not well represented in the discussion of translational ecology and other knowledge exchange-like concepts, which is important not only because graduate students are the largest constituency in academic programs, Also because they are most often at the forefront of the research. Often grants are in the names of the PIs or the graduate advisors, while graduate students are the ones doing the work, breaking ground and publishing. And also because we are potentially the next generation of professional translational ecologists. So the graduate academic experience is fertile ground for building bridges between practitioners, decision makers, and stakeholders to more effectively address real-world environmental problems. So this is my small attempt at giving voice to graduate students producing or pursuing interdisciplinary research with the translational ecology framework. In order to do that, I need to talk about my own research and situate us all under the context for how translational ecology is being used. So here's my study species, the Arctic ground squirrel. My study site is in Denali National Park and Preserve in the interior of Alaska. There's a lot of interest in studying this species, not only because they're cute, but because they're also useful for studying how systems are changing because of climate change. In Denali, they've been labeled as a vital sign for indicating potential impacts of climate change. For various reasons, there are keystone species in Denali National Park, the grizzly bears, the golden eagles, the red foxes, everything in the park eats them. They're an ecosystem engineer. Part of this has to do with because they have specialized habitat requirements. They live communally in burrows. Of course, soil conditions must be habitable for the burrowing. And finally, it just so happens that their habitat needs overlap with vulnerable tundra habitat. And so despite being easy to observe and having a geographic range larger than most other ground dwelling species, so we find Arctic ground squirrels all the way from Northeast Siberia and Alaska and also Canada, neither the ecology nor their climate change vulnerability is well understood. And so this is where I come in at. So early conversations with resource managers at Denali helped shape my dissertation into this simple question: how will Arctic ground squirrels respond to climate change? In other words, how vulnerable are they? And I've shaped my research around these three broad areas: adaptive capacity, which I'll briefly provide an example of, given the time that we have, right? The potential for species or populations to tolerate or adapt to climate change. Sensitivity, the degree to which the survival and persistence of species are affected by climate change, and then exposure, the magnitude of climate change likely to be experienced by the species across its range. And under these three broad areas, I use a combination of hierarchical modeling, population genomics, and ecological niche modeling to address this very broad question. And so getting back to the adaptive capacity, one metric is genetic diversity. We know that genetic diversity is a species biological toolset for responding to and adapting to their environment. And is advantageous to a population, particularly because it enables some individuals to adapt to the environment while maintaining the survival of the population. And so one of my goals for my dissertation is to conduct a detailed population genomic analysis using genome-wide SNP data that would both inform the basic landscape and molecular ecology of the species and help guide its management in a region with active and ongoing monitoring efforts. And so it's like the trifecta, right? I have three generally broad questions that are part of using this genomic data. I'll talk about the first one I have in bold, which is, are there distinct genetic clusters? Likely the first thing you want to do when you have this type of data is find out if there's structure in your samples. And then you can go into, if you do find structure, how do we characterize it? And then looking at genetic diversity. But to provide you an example, so this is my study area in Denali National Park. All of this sampling was co-located with long-term vegetation monitoring plots. So there's a systematic grid that spans the 12,800 kilometer square area of the park, which is about the size of Maine. Each of these nodes are spaced about 10 kilometers intervals in each of these cases. And then at each node, there's a nested sampling grid located with sampling stations in the 5x5 arrangement. And each of these are separated by 500 meters. And so this is where I was out trapping Arctic ground squirrels and collecting tissue samples. So briefly just going back to this, the areas in red are the particular sites where I was collecting tissue samples from. And the habitat occupied by these species at those sites sits within a landscape matrix dominated by forests at elevations less than 760 meters. So this is what one of those sites potentially look like. Scrub vegetation and spruce woodland in the subalpine zone. So this is about 760 to 1,070 meters. And then low tundra in the alpine zone, so above 1,070 meters. And it's fragmented by natural barriers, such as glacially fed rivers, and also anthropogenic barriers, such as the Park Road. So there's potentially a lot of avenues for structuring to happen for all of the individuals within the park boundaries. And so the first question, are there distinct genetic clusters? We evaluated population genetic structure with multiple analytical methods. I'm just going to talk about the Bayesian clustering framework that I implemented with fast structure. And based on this model, we predicted that there are 3 to 5 clusters within Denali National Park. That's the model is saying that this is the most likely, most probability based on the data that we collected, which is a pretty interesting pattern. Arctic ground squirrels have a pretty small dispersal capacity, each of these sites being about 10 kilometers apart from each other, and yet indicating that there's a relative amount of structure, not a high amount. It's pretty interesting given the species and their location and how they're distributed through the park. Why this may be important is that groups of populations or clusters could warrant separate management or priority for conservation because of high genetic and ecological distinctiveness, what most agencies refer to as conservation units. So not only is it our job as translational ecologists to provide information, but also to provide guidance as well. So agencies, organizations are usually constrained by their budget. We all know that intimately, while also simultaneously balancing several conservation needs. And so one of the relevant questions, more often than not, is how much effort do I need to put in to get the data that I want to answer the questions that I have or to address my conservation needs? And so because we're also interested in helping them develop a long-term protocol for monitoring, I've been using data from my hierarchical models, using a simulation framework to evaluate the effects of survey effort, and then comparing model performance amongst these different scenarios. So there's been a lot of work going again on in this translational ecology framework. And so now the challenges, right? The 2 I'm going to talk to you about is access and inclusion, and then power asymmetries. So the first one, access and inclusion, this refers to people, institution, and resources. While practical frameworks for stakeholder engagement, particularly natural resource and environmental management research exist, they may not apply that well to early stage translational research for folks early in their career stage. So graduate students, referring to myself here. And this is in particular relevant to highlight because most of the research on the challenge of access to resources focus on the demand side or from stakeholders. We're all used to the scenario where a manager has a conservation problem or need, a decision needs to be made to address this, but they lack the data. But what happens when it's the scientists that have an inability of engaging with or accessing these things? In my particular case, I'm in the unique position of initiating my own translational ecology process. So I've been the only individual working at each step of the way. So doing the initial research of identifying what potential needs are, meeting with and engaging the stakeholders to cultivate relationships and help hone our questions to create actionable science. If you don't know, part of doing research in national parks, period, after successfully receiving a research permit, you get paired with the scientists in the park so you can get oriented to how to navigate utilizing the resources on hand to conduct your science. And so my example about one of the difficulties with access and inclusion is that my first day in the park, the scientist assigned to help be my mentor, to help me navigate the resources in the park, informed me that they would not be able to help me at all. And so Every single summer, when I would go up and collect my data, I was always finding out something new that would have made the experience of collecting data a lot easier. And so I have not been able to quantify what this impact has been on my research, but it does call into question the effectiveness of graduate student participation and the translational ecology process. And so some relevant questions here are, for one, what barriers currently exist for graduate students' participation, and how can these be overcome? How does the development of relationships in this process, how do we enable it to be more effective for graduate students? For instance, I'm looking at the time here. And then the second challenge is power asymmetries. So I have no doubt that part of what I've experienced has been informed by or delineated by status. So differences in formal education status, in resources and skills, prevent equal participation of graduate students in the translational ecology process. So most folks, when they're talking about this, are referring to power dynamics. So this is including the relative position or status of those generating and using knowledge, and often significantly affects who has access to knowledge and who is supported to generate it, and how it is then used to transform and be used in the translational ecology framework. And so often graduate students are being positioned as lacking resources, skills, and education status, rather than being in transition of obtaining these things. And so both practitioners and researchers can help address this. And some relevant questions here with regards to power asymmetries. One, for instance, how does power or status influence translational ecology? How can it be leveraged to empower graduate students to be a part of the process? And then a final one to wrap this up is what stakeholders, circumstances, and contexts are best suited for graduate student participation. So we had an example from IO where graduate students are often entering the translational ecology process at different entry points. So this is relevant for this particular reason. And so with that, I'd like to propose a question to the audience and also to the panel potentially, which has relevance for other graduate students, their advisors who operate in the translational ecology framework, and stakeholders that are seeking to collaborate with scientists. What are graduate students' perspectives on the translational ecology process, and how could they be used to potentially transform or practice translational ecology? And more specifically, how do we explicitly account for how graduate students who are uniquely situated in the translational ecology process? And that includes my talk.
Excellent. Thank you, Nigel. Thanks to all of the speakers. That was super. We've got about 10 minutes left. And so I just wanted to share, I think I'm gonna go like this. Yay, everybody, because I don't think any of you can do that, but you can put it in the chat. There's lots of nice things being said, Nigel, about your talk. And I'll invite all the other speakers to come on here. I'm going to share my screen to look at some of the things that are showing up in the Jamboard, and hopefully, I'm not sure if you're seeing the Jamboard. Let's try it again. Screen 2, there it is. Are you seeing the Jamboard?
Yep.
Great. All right, so we've got some great comments here already talking about, so kind of what works well. People are talking about attending joint conferences. People that wear two hats or are boundary spanners, so they come from that perspective of being able to translate in the moment. Carrie pointed out our translational invasion ecology paper. We talk a lot about boundary spanning in that paper. Hugh Stafford, also the Forest Service regional ecologist out in California, headed a paper in the translational ecology special issue on boundary spanning. So that's a really important aspect of this. If somebody could do me a favor and put the special issue, the translational ecology special issue in the chat, I'd super appreciate it. So there's some more conversation around using structured decision making, or at least the principles of decision science can help developing personal relationships and sustaining communication and collaboration. Those are some of the principles we had called out in our flower and translational ecology. Nigel just talked about some of the barriers to working on this. Be happy to hear from the early career scientists in the audience about this. There are unique ones for early career and students. But we can see some here. So both the researchers and the managers and practitioners talk about the challenges with funding. So there's certain places, for example, probably NSF, that don't want to fund the more kind of management applied side of things historically. And so thinking about those being less fundable, I'll just put in a pitch that I've been told that knowledge co-production, translational ecology work is not publishable, but I've started building a decent CV on it. I have a lot of papers and a lot of great journals on translational work. So don't let them tell you that you can't do it. Just do it. And as Ayodele was saying, I find that it's very rewarding because you're doing work that feels impactful, that's making a difference. Any of the panelists want to call out anything they see on this Jamboard? Any of these pages of the Jamboard that strikes them?
I don't have, my question isn't really specific to the Jamboard. I kind of have a question or follow-up from Nigel's talk, if that's okay.
Let's do it.
So this isn't really fully formed, so I apologize. But Nigel, you were talking about, some of the barriers for graduate students getting involved with this type of work. And it got me thinking that oftentimes these types of projects take several years to kind of materialize, right? Building the relationships, talking, but conversations between the managers and the researchers to determine what the objectives are, finding the funding, those types of things all take time. And graduate students don't have a lot of time usually. So I guess my question is, what's the best approach for getting grad students involved in these types of projects? Is it better to bring the grad student in once all of those things have, this is typically what happens. The grad student comes in once all of that groundwork has been laid and the funding has been secured, and then they kind of take over. But they lose the experience of having gone through the process of building up the project, which could be really valuable. However, I think from what I understand with your work, you started with square one, and that's been really challenging and potentially caused, I don't know if it's delayed your timeline or whatever, but it sounds like there's been significant challenges involved there. So yeah, I don't know if you have thoughts on how to handle that, or if anyone does.
Yeah, my first reaction to that is there's not a bad method, right? If you have a PI who has done the initial groundwork, then it could be their responsibility to create multiple entry points for that graduate student to then get in on the project. And we often use this language a lot, right? When we're talking about having diverse stakeholders and helping them take ownership over that project as well. And so that's perhaps one entry point. Starting from the beginning, like you said, is really difficult, particularly because in many situations with different stakeholders, there has to be a very intensive process of relationship building. But as been talked about in the foundational piece and some of the other papers attached to that special issue, not every single translational ecology process is going to look the same. And so sometimes we don't necessarily need for there to be much of a developed process for building trust. Particularly because you may have the credentials from your institutions, you may have the credentials of having your advisor. And so hopefully in some ways, those are able to buffer having to potentially endure a long process of developing trust. But there's not going to be one way for me to answer that question, or for that in general. And I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, yeah, certainly. I didn't expect you to have a one answer, but I think it's one challenge.
Hey, Morelli, do you want to speak to that? You've had experience with your advisor, the same advisor as Nigel, where you had we had identified more your stakeholders ahead of time.
Yeah, so I have seen it from my perspective, and then seeing how it after listening to your talk, Nigel, and I feel lucky, and I'm not sure if that's the right word to say here, but I definitely feel that a lot, I have help that I know that I can go back and be like, oh, well, can you look over this because I'm really confused, or there's just a little bit more feedback I feel from my standpoint and more guidance. And I do feel that that has helped me within my 2 years. And I do agree that graduate school is really short. And so I think it definitely did help me out a good amount.
Thanks, Morelli. Yeah, and Nigel and I have had many, many conversations about the power dynamics around translational work, and how sometimes maybe it is actually reinforcing some of the old power dynamics, and it's potentially problematic. And someday we're going to write a paper about it, but for now, we're having this conversation in this public place. Anything else that we can call out? We're seeing so many great comments on these Jamboards. Well, I do see thinking about what has worked, and we talked about kind of trying to come from both perspectives, whether you do formally or informally in your job, and building relationships, which we talked a lot about. There's also the piece of kind of trying to identify objectives. So I think all of our speakers alluded to this to some degree. Sort of, we used to have a joke about when we're producing science early on at the CASC, saying to our stakeholder partners, like, what do you need? And we would hear back, what do we need? We'd say, no, what do you need? And they'd say, well, what do we need? And so really, like, that's where this is, you need to take a while and figure out really, and as the managers and practitioners in the audience know, like, what are the actual actions that you take in a year? Because that's the things that are gonna, or could take, because that's where science is gonna be able to improve a decision. Everything else is sort of just kind of academic, so to speak. So we're running the bend on this session. I really appreciate you all being here, and hopefully, you can learn, have some takeaways from our Jamboard as well. Excellent talks. I'm so happy that you all took your time to do this with us. And that's what we're here to do at the CASC, is link management and science and management. So hopefully you picked up some of the ways we're doing that, some of the ways we could all do it better, and some of the challenges that are to that as we all move forward, both as mentors and mentees, and senior and early career, and everything in between. So thank you. Please come back. Oh, I have words I have to say. There's a survey to fill out for the whole meeting. After a short break, we'll resume for our final session at 3:45, where we'll have a chance to participate in a collaborative networking activity before closing the symposium. We hope you'll join us. See everybody soon.